My heels clap against the courthouse marble, every step cracking through the hush like thunder on ice. I can feel the stairs burn between my shoulder blades, the hiss of whispers curling through the benches as I walk what feels like the longest 50 feet I've ever crossed. Reporters tilt forward, pens poised like bayonets. The Langford scandal is not a headline anymore. It's a live show and I'm the unwilling lead. I don't turn when I hear my mother's laugh, low, precise, and perfectly timed to humiliate. I've known that sound all my life, a velvet-trapped blade. In my periphery, my father shakes his head, disappointment radiating the way heat rises off asphalt. For 32 years I have been Beatrice Langford, the daughter measured and always found wanting. Not today. Today, for the first time, I am not the accused. They are. I sit beside Assistant U.S. Attorney Sandra Miller and smooth the sleeve of my navy blazer with hands I refuse to let shake. She gives a small professional nod, one soldier to another. The weight of our evidence presses around us like the air before a storm. Ready, she murmurs. Am I ready to pull down the house that built me? In Portland, the name Langford still opens doors. 12 rental complexes stretching across the city, 3 glittering lake front homes, over $8 million in assets. My father raised that empire brick by brick over 4 decades. Graham Langford, the man whose approval I chased as if I could catch it if I only ran faster. Behind us, my mother sits like a photograph come to life. Diane Langford, sovereign of galas and symphonies, grace polished to a lethal shine, pearl necklace, impeccable posture, smile as delicate and as cold as cut crystal. 2 rows back, my brother Ethan scrolls his phone, bored, the golden sun at 30, 5 still gleaming in the dimmest light. He doesn't look up when I enter. He never had to. My mind slips to 2016, when the market buckled and our numbers bled month after month. I remember my father's ashen face, the tremor in his hands. I remember stepping in when his health wavered, dating our days, triage decisions, plugging leaks with my own body. I remember wiring $520,000, my future, my plans, straight into the company, no contract, no strings, only faith. 3 months later, when the tide turned and the profit sheets turned black, we sat at the long mahogany table. My mother carved her steak with surgeon's care. The board has concerns, my father said, not meeting my eyes. Concerns? My fork hovered. About what? The manner. My mother replied, dabbing her lips. It suggests a tendency to overreach. You mean the money that kept the company alive? I asked, waiting for the joke that never came. You were born to follow, not to lead, Beatrice, she said, laying down her knife. Some people must accept their station. The words cut deeper than any blade. I left that night with a folder of balance sheets and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The door closed behind me with the finality of a vault. Now, under the fluorescent lights, I meet Sandra's gaze and feel something I haven't felt in years. Respect, level and steady. Yes, I tell her, voice calm despite the tremor of an earthquake under my ribs. I'm ready. Judge Alan McKinney takes the bench, face unreadable. The room settles. I wonder if he senses it. The accumulated years of gaslighting and control about to be hauled into daylight. My father's familiar disapproval prickles my back. My mother shifts just so, arranging concern on her face like jewelry. Ethan finally lifts his eyes, a hint of a smirk playing at his lips. I think of the endless small cuts, the erosion of silence, nothing like the gilded heaviness of my childhood home. It was my space, my rules. Then a gray parcel appeared at my door. No stamp, no return address, my name in block letters that made my stomach knot. I set it on the counter as if it might tick. I made coffee I didn't drink. I aligned spoons that didn't need aligning. When I finally tore the paper, a sealed envelope slid out, for her eyes only. H. Langford, my grandfather's handwriting, blocky capitals that belonged to an era where signatures were vows. Henry had been gone 6 years, but those letters were unmistakable. My hands shook as I broke the seal. A will, dated 2004, handwritten, the ink a little faded but clear. I, Henry Langford, bequeath all properties, holdings, and assets to my granddaughter, Beatrice Langford. I sat hard on the couch, the paper trembling. It couldn't be real. I had watched the will be read after his funeral. I had watched everything go to Ethan, not a keepsake for me. I pulled up probate records and set the 2 wills side by side. The official version favored Ethan. The letter in my hands favored me. The signatures were close, but not the same. One was forged. Back then, Oregon had no digital will registry, an exploitable gap for someone who knew where the locks were soft. Someone like my father. 3 days later, the phone rang me out of a shallow sleep. "Is this Beatrice Langford?" A rough old voice asked. "Who's calling?" "Caleb Warner. I worked for your grandfather's attorney, the one who vanished in 2009. A pause. "He refused to alter Henry's will. That's why he disappeared. We met at a riverside cafe. Caleb arrived with a measured limp and pale blue eyes behind thick lenses. 'You look like Henry,' he said quietly, as if speaking to a ghost. He set a scratched flash drive between us. 'Insurance,' he said. 'Your grandfather's attorney recorded everything.' Alone that night, I plugged it in. A trembling voice filled the room. They made me forge the will. Graham and Diane, they used a real signature from a 1998 deed. If I didn't cooperate, I'd regret it. I'm leaving town tonight. If anything happens, the audio cut off. I played it again and again. Each time, something hard crystallized in me. The 1998 deed, Lake Oswego. I remembered it. The forged signature matched that deed too perfectly. Perfection is a tell when it comes to forgery. The next morning, I rented a safety deposit box. The original will and Caleb's notarized statement went inside. I made encrypted copies, stashed them in clouds and drives, and with friends who would take a bullet for me. Nights disappeared into estate law and statute limitations and forensic handwriting guides. I was building a case the way my father built his empire, brick by careful brick. I'll testify. Caleb said over coffee a week later, "My reputation be damned. This isn't only forgery." I told him, squeezing his weathered hand. "It's theft of time. They stole years I could have spent building what Henry meant me to have. The trail took me to Bend, to Althea Monroe, 80, to Henry's former housekeeper. Her small room was a museum of photographs and careful memory. I was there when he signed it," she said, fingers trembling over a worn album. "Your mother stood behind him." She tapped a photo, Henry at his desk, the attorney beside him, my mother a shadow in the corner. June 2004, I sent the scan to days later, I came home to on top of the mess lay a single I gathered the people. The year had done its worst. It hadn't stopped. They had raced all the way. Ethan's name lit my phone. I let it ring twice. "We need to talk about what you're doing," he said without greeting, his tone pitched between irritation and unease. "I'm not doing anything," I said, watching the skyline through my window. "I'm telling the truth. Do you know what this is doing to Mom, to Dad?" His voice thinned. "People are talking. People were always talking. The invitations that dried up, the sidelong looks at the market, my mother's whisper campaign, gentle concerns about my mental state, tidy doubts seated in the best places. In this city, Diane's soft concern carried more weight than any shouted accusation. The Rotary disinvited Mom next month. Ethan pressed, 30 years of charity work. I'm sure that's hard for her, I said evenly. Dad's having people look into your finances. If you're desperate, I'm not desperate. I cut in, except for the truth. I didn't add that our mortgage lender had questions about a 3-year-old application, or that the gallery reviewing my consignment agreement had suddenly found issues. Small levers pressed at once. Just stop this before it gets worse, he said, the condescension creeping back like mold, for everyone's sake. After we hung up, an email from Caleb arrived. Someone followed him home from the grocery store. No explicit threat, just a chill. I didn't retreat. That's what they were counting on the Beatrice who made peace, who wired $500,000 and then left quietly when told to. She was gone. The next morning, I carried my binders into Sandra Miller's office. The place felt like a fortress. She studied Henry's will through reading glasses. If your father threatened his lawyer, and that lawyer disappeared, we're not just talking probate, she said. We're talking potential federal crimes. I've put everything in order, I said, sliding over a timeline. The will, witness statements, transactions after Henry's death, shell companies, transfers designed to vanish. This pattern repeats, I said, not just with me. You understand what you're doing? Sandra asked softly. You're mapping a conspiracy. My phone buzzed. Ethan, meet us at the lodge. We just want to talk. The Langford Lodge sits deep in the pines of Deschutes County, the lake a black mirror at dusk. I drove there alone. My phone recording app hummed silently in my pocket. Inside, they had staged the room like a portrait. Diane at one end, pearls glowing, Graham at the other, stubborn jaw set, Ethan playing host between them, pouring wine with a smile he'd practiced his whole life. Beatrice, my mother said, rising halfway, thank you for coming. We should clear the air. My father said gruffly, direct is best. I replied, taking a seat where my phone could hear everything. This has gotten out of hand. Diane said, we're worried about you. Your health. Graham clarified, the strain of these delusions. My eyes flicked to the folder by his elbow. What's that? A solution, Ethan said, sliding it across. Simple, clean, final. A single document, waiver of all claims against the Langford estate. One signature and everything disappears. Sign, my father said, voice softening in the way it did when he wanted obedience. We'll establish a trust, not what you imagine you deserve, but enough. What exactly am I waiving? I asked. Everything. Ethan said, all rights, all this nonsense about forgery. He glanced at my father. She doesn't need to carry your mess anymore, Dad. You already handled that lawyer, right? Silence clanged. My father didn't deny it. My mother's fingers tightened on her glass. I stood, leaving the paper untouched. I'm done pretending. Family loyalty still matters. My mother called as I reached the door. It does, I said, turning, which is exactly why I'm doing this. Out among the trees, a pair of headlights winked out. Someone was watching. In my pocket, the recording app glowed. Ethan's words captured and safe. Within 2 weeks, the scaffolding began to shift. Althea signed her affidavit. Caleb turned down a bribe and recorded the offer. Sandra filed to reopen probate and lodged complaints with the bar. A business journal asked cautious questions about Langford Holdings. Diane's charity board scheduled an emergency meeting. Graham's first health scare followed the delivery of the legal notices. At midnight, Ethan called with a raw voice and a simple demand. "Just tell us what you want." What grandfather intended, I answered. The next morning, I carried white roses to Mount Calvary. Henry's headstone was simple, as he would have wanted. I arranged the flowers and unfolded a letter I'd read 100 times. If she stands before you, she has already carried more weight than any man in this family. For the first time, my tears were not bitter. They were cleansing. I won't let them erase you, I whispered, or me. Days later, as Sandra and I prepped for court, a manila envelope slid under my door. Inside, a photo of Henry's study, a red circle around the landscape painting behind his desk. I stared until the misalignment clicked into view, a safe, hidden in plain sight. "Sandra," I said into the phone, "there's something else." Dawn brought a federal warrant and a row of navy jackets on the Langford lawn. The limestone facade looked smaller now. Only stone and mortar, no myths. Sandra rang. My father, in a belted robe, opened the door, and when he saw me, shock cracked across his face like lightning. "Federal warrant to search the premises," Sandra said, holding up the paper. "Step aside, Mr. Langford." On the stairs behind him, my mother appeared, silk immaculate at sunrise. Only the twitch at her eye betrayed the quake beneath the marble. "What do you hope to gain with this spectacle?" Grandfather had always left me a way through. Inside the safe lay a careful time capsule, Henry's leather, bound journal, a slim stack of letters bound with twine, a manila folder of ledgers, and, tucked into the back corner, a small USB drive. My father's color drained the moment he saw the journal. He knew what a man like Henry wrote down, and how thoroughly. The family attorney burst in 20 minutes later, hair tousled and shirt half buttoned, insisting on limits to the search. Sandra read the warrant line by line, her voice even as granite. In the dining room, Graham clutched his chest and complained of palpitations. In her study, Diane dialed every number in her Rolodex voice, soothing and precise, stacking favors like sandbags before a flood. Henry's journal was a map. In neat, steady script, he documented conversations about the estate, doubts about my father's growing influence, and pointed notes. If I am pressured, the will goes to Beatrice. She alone understands stewardship over spectacle. The letters echoed the same theme, correspondence with his attorney about safeguarding his wishes. Photographs, dated in his hand, contradicted the tidy timeline my parents had sold the court, and the USB Sandra's tech specialist cracked it open in minute, shielded backups of lost company records and an audio file labeled simply, Testament. My grandfather's voice filled the study, familiar as the creak of his leather chair. "This is my verbal confirmation. If I die, every asset of Langford Estates passes to my granddaughter, Beatrice Ann. She has the integrity for what comes next." Something inside me unlocked with a click as clean as the safe's tumblers. I had not invented the path. I had been walking the one he laid. The next morning, a paper ran a front, page exclusive, with unnamed sources calling me unstable, vindictive, opportunistic. It painted me as the prodigal who abandoned the business when things got hard, carefully omitting the $500,000 I poured in to keep the lights on. "They're running the standard play," Sandra said, scanning the column. "Smear, isolate, pressure." The city performed its choreography. Friends crossed streets rather than meet my eyes. Whispered emails questioned Caleb's reliability. Old donors called Sandra's superiors, questioning why the Department of Justice was interfering in a family matter. But rot never stays hidden once air hits it. 3 former employees submitted sworn statements about my role during the downturn. The accounting firm produced the documentation of my $520,000 transfer, the same records my parents swore had vanished. Sandra scheduled a press briefing. The story drifted from gossip to public record. At the nursing home, Althea's health waned, but her memory burned steady. Her nurse helped record a video deposition, a clear account of Henry signing the original will, my mother hovering behind him, watching every move. 2 board members resigned from Langford Holdings, citing personal reasons. A bank it flagged odd flows through Ethan's accounts. Diane's signature charity announced an internal financial review. Judge McKinney denied the family's request to stall proceedings and added a line that landed like a bell. The evidence suggested potential elder abuse. I watched my parents argue in the courthouse lot, heads bent close, the public polish gone. My father jabbed a finger as his voice carried, "You said no one would check the signatures." And for a moment, the mask slipped and the truth stood bare in full daylight. A few nights later, Ethan unraveled at a downtown club, shouting down anyone who spoke our name. The family attorney arrived at Sandra's office with a settlement proposal that acknowledged certain misunderstandings and protected my parents from criminal exposure. Sandra slid it back without a glance. "We've moved past misunderstandings," she said. So had I. I turned my loft into a safe house. New locks, a hardwired security system, cameras framing every entrance. The court accelerated our schedule to accommodate Althea's deposition. "They'll get reckless now," Sandra warned during our last evidence check. "Be smart." I nodded, surprising myself with how calm I was. Henry used to say that truth has patience. Mine did, and it was done waiting. Just before midnight, Caleb called with a voice bright as a struck match. I found something in the archive, his last case notes. An hour later, a courier placed a slim folder in my hands. The missing lawyer had documented a meeting in which my father directly threatened Henry over the will. Intent, on paper, the piece that converts a family dispute into a criminal conspiracy. I read the page twice, then a third time, the words settling like iron. They hadn't only cut me out. They had tried to bend a dying man's will with fear. Dawn of court day came clean and thin. I stood before the mirror and saw a woman I barely recognized, shoulders squared, eyes clear, a steadiness that didn't need to be performed. The navy blazer I'd chosen felt less like armor now and more like a uniform. Duty, not vengeance. The courtroom pulsed with camera clicks and whispers. I walked in measured steps, no longer the woman who had once crept under the weight of a name. Across the aisle, my family assembled their tableau. Graham looked older than his 68 years, knuckles white where his hands clasped. Diane's pearls caught the fluorescence. She leaned toward Ethan and murmured something I didn't need to hear. Their attorney, Richards, a sleek predator in a costly suit, leaned in as I passed and whispered, "You're about to be ruined, M.S. Langford." I met his gaze. "I'm not here to ruin anyone," I said quietly. "I'm here to tell the truth." Even I was surprised by how plainly it landed. I sat. Sandra arranged exhibits with the unhurried precision of someone who knows the tide is with her. Their side moved first. Witnesses filed through with scripted concern. Former board members I barely knew painted me as erratic and ungrateful. Family friends testified to my concerning behavior, with carefully rehearsed furrows in their brows. Ethan took the stand and delivered his performance with glossy eyes and practiced sincerity. The dutiful son trying to protect the legacy from his reckless sister. The man who couldn't name 3 properties in our portfolio suddenly wore the language of stewardship like a borrowed suit. My mother followed, weaving her favorite story. Maternal concern. We only ever wanted what was best for Beatrice, she said, fingertips grazing her throat. Leadership never fit her, despite our hopes. Graham closed their parade, voice gravelly with authority, framing every decision as a necessity for survival. The gallery absorbed it, some nodding along as though listening to a sermon they'd heard for years. By adjournment, the murmurs trailed me through the hall like a fog. Poor, deluded Beatrice, pity is a leash if you let it be. I slept 4 hours and woke with my chest light, not heavy. Day 2 was ours. When court reconvened, Sandra rose. The government calls Sandra Miller, she said, and the room stiffened at the switch. Prosecutor to witness. Judge McKinney inclined his head. Proceed. Photographs followed, time, stamped to match her memory. Ledgers slid into view, my $520.00 transfer in black and white. Board minutes documenting my removal 3 months later. The judge leaned forward. For the record, he said, this court knew the decedent socially. I see no conflict. His questions sharpened as evidence stacked, his interest keen rather than clouded. Sandra called a surprise witness, Jessica Barnes, the missing lawyer's former assistant. Jessica described files destroyed under pressure, conversations in hushed tones, men who stood too close to her desk. Caleb followed with the recovered case notes. The forensic specialist overlaid signatures, the genuine against the official, and the differences drew themselves in unforgiving lines. Banking records tied to shell companies illuminated a choreography of transfers days after Henry's death. Finally, Sandra lifted a single sheet and read aloud, Henry's letter to me, the words I'd carried all this time. If she stands before you, she has already carried more weight than any man in this family. I watched the last of my mother's composure fissure. Her fingers clenched her pearls until her knuckles blanched. My father stared at the table, colorless. Ethan's gaze fell to his lap, the room's oxygen too heavy to breathe. Judge McKinney paged through the exhibits one last time, the silence thick as snowfall. This is not complicated, he said at last. It is criminal. The gavel's strike rang like a clean break. He restored Langford estates to me, ordered charges for forgery and obstruction, and referred the matter for criminal prosecution. In closing remarks, he named the elder abuse plainly. As people stood, I heard my mother's whisper to Graham, "You promised this would never happen," thin and strangled. Outside, Ethan stepped into my path, eyes wild. "You've ruined everything," he said, like an accusation and a plea. "No," I answered, calm as a lake at dawn. "You did." Sandra's hand found my shoulder. "Henry would be proud," she said gently. For the first time I believed her. 3 months after the verdict, the courthouse steps finally stood empty. The media vans were gone, the cameras dismantled, the frenzy spent. My name still floated through legal journals and whispered conversations at Portland's fundraisers events I no longer attended. The Langford empire, once untouchable, had fractured like porcelain under pressure. My father surrendered his real estate license 2 days before a massive stroke stole the strength from the right side of his body. My mother disappeared from charity boards without farewell, retreating to a modest house on Lake Oswego's quieter edge. And Ethan, the golden son-turned pariah, now spent his days hammering nails into foundation frames in Bend, building modest homes where Langford Holdings once raised only luxury estates. The irony was poetic, but I found no joy in it. Only balance. One golden evening, I drove the same winding forest road back to Crystal Lake. The trees arched above me like a cathedral, sunlight breaking through in shards. This time there was no dread, no trap waiting at the end. The lodge looked smaller now, stripped of its ghosts. I parked where I had that night of confrontation and walked to the dock, the lake silver under the fading light. From my pocket, I pulled the creased note that had haunted me through every turn. Legacy isn't inherited, it's earned. I flicked open Henry's old silver lighter, the only keepsake of his I'd kept all these years, and touched the flame to the paper. Orange spread across his blocky handwriting until it curled to ash, scattering over the water and disappearing into ripples. They laughed when I walked in. I whispered to the still air, but they weren't laughing when I walked out. That moment wasn't revenge, it was release. Since the verdict, people had begun finding me strangers carrying stories that echoed my own. 3 whistleblowers from a collapsed investment firm, 4 retirees stripped of their savings by a false advisor, a young mother crushed by a predatory lender. Different names, same story, power-twisting truth, silence bought with fear. I saw myself in every one of them. Justice, I realized, means nothing if it ends at the courthouse door. The $4. 6 million settlement sat untouched for months, heavy in my account like unspent ammunition. Then I knew what it was meant for. I used it to found the Langford Foundation for Legal Integrity, a small office in downtown Portland where people silenced by money or influence could finally speak. Free legal aid, ethical investigations, second chances. The irony of reclaiming the Langford name wasn't lost on me, but perhaps that was the point. Names can change meaning. Legacies can be rewritten. A year later, I stood in front of 8 law students at the University of Oregon, chalk dust clinging to my fingertips. I wrote 2 sentences on the board: integrity builds legacy. Legacy isn't given, it's built. They watched in stillness, some skeptical, some curious. They'd all studied my case. It was now printed in their textbooks under probate, fraud, and elder abuse. But what they came to hear wasn't about law. It was about courage, the kind that stands alone against family, reputation, and fear. Letters came sometimes from my mother, written on elegant stationery, scented faintly of her favorite jasmine perfume. Carefully worded, cautiously apologetic. My father's recovery had left him confined to a wheelchair, surrounded by nurses instead of admirers. Ethan wrote once too just a single paragraph about learning to find purpose in honest labor. I read their words without anger, without triumph. Forgiveness had taken root quietly, not as reunion, but as release. Boundaries could hold peace as easily as distance. As I erased the board, laughter from the courtyard drifted through the open window. For years that sound had been a weapon in my mother's mouth, sharp, mocking, designed to remind me of my place. Now it floated in light and warmth, a simple melody of youth. It didn't wound, it healed. Outside, the spring sun filtered through new leaves, painting the walkways gold. I caught my reflection in the glass, older, steadier, softer. The mirrored image of the girl who once trembled under her family's gaze had vanished. In her place stood a woman who had earned her name, not inherited it. Legacy, I realized, isn't about wealth or property or power. It's about impact, the lives you restore, the truths you refuse to bury, the courage you pass on. The circle had closed from the silenced daughter to the woman who teaches others how to speak. And as I smiled, it wasn't the polished Langford smile my mother had trained me to wear. It was real, it was mine, and somewhere, I hoped, Henry recognized it.